When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and the shouts of praise to the king, she hurried to the Lord's temple to see what was happening. When she arrived, she saw the newly crowned king standing in his place of authority by the pillar at the temple entrance. The commanders and trumpeters were surrounding him, and people from all over the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Singers with musical instruments were leading the people in a great celebration. When Athaliah saw this, she tore her clothes in despair and shouted, "Treason! Treason!" You know, realistically, one could kind of argue that what they were committing was an act of treason, certainly against her as, you know, the ruler of Judah at the time, but I don't think their intentions were bad. Is committing treason against a bad ruler really a bad thing? I would argue not so much. What's up, cool people? My name's Matt. Welcome back to our Bible study. Alrighty. We're looking at 2 Chronicles chapter 23. So this is focusing on Judah just because this is like a recap meant originally for the exiles that, you know, had lived in Judah before, and it's honestly part of an effort to try and get them to go back, build or rebuild the temple, and otherwise just kind of dedicate themselves to God. And the past couple of chapters, there's been a few changes at King of Judah, you know, within the recap. And things took a pretty steep downturn, especially in terms of, you know, kings who worshipped God or not, and, you know, encouraged the people to do so, whichever they were doing. As things currently stand, there is actually a queen of Judah. She kind of pretty much made a bid for power after her son died. He was the king, but then, like, he didn't really have any other living relatives besides his mother, the current queen, who were seemingly in a position to rule. He did have one very young son who survived, but he's been kind of sheltered away in the temple, I think, actually. Essentially living with the priests. But in the meantime, we have this situation. And yeah, so we'll pick things up here in chapter 23 and see what happens. In the 7th year of Athaliah's reign, Jehoiada the priest decided to act. He summoned his courage and made a pact with 5 army commanders: Azariah, son of Jeroham. Sorry, I read that wrong for a sec. Ishmael, son of Jehohanan. Azariah, son of Obed. Maaseiah, son of Adiah. And Elishaphat, son of Zikri. Or Zikri, either way. These men traveled secretly throughout Judah and summoned the Levites and clan leaders in all the towns to come to Jerusalem. They gathered at the temple of God, where they made a solemn pact with Joash, the young king. Jehoiada said to them, "Here is the king's son. The time has come for him to reign. The Lord has promised that a descendant of David will be our king. This is what you must do. When you priests and Levites come on duty on the Sabbath, a third of you will serve as gatekeepers. Another third will go over to the royal palace, and the final third will be at the foundation gate. Everyone else should stay in the courtyards of the Lord's temple. Remember, only the priests and Levites on duty may enter the temple of the Lord, for they are set apart as holy. The rest of the people must obey the Lord's instructions and stay outside. You Levites, form a bodyguard around the king and keep your weapons in hand. Kill anyone who tries to enter the temple, and stay with the king wherever he goes. Okay, pausing there for a bit. So, Jehoiada, the priest, has had enough of the queen. Now, perhaps justifiably so, because she herself kind of went on a rampage, you might say. Let me go back to the previous chapter for a second, because it mentions, it just says she began to destroy the rest of Judah's royal family, but still, like, she clearly was seeking to gain and maintain power, and or just didn't want anyone from, like, the Judah side of the family, we'll say, to stay alive, and possibly, I don't know if that was necessarily the motivation, but, you know, she had actually been more so connected, at least, with the side of the family that was from the other tribes of Israel. For those who don't know, I think it was after Jehoshaphat. Yeah, Jehoshaphat had one of his sons marry one of the daughters of King Ahab of the other tribes. And so that was where a bunch of the influence of, you know, not worshiping God came from. Because at that point, pretty much after Judah and the other tribes split, the other tribes didn't really follow God anymore from that point forward. So, influence from the other tribes who didn't follow God pretty much made its way to a very high position in Judah because of that marriage, and the following couple of kings were ones born under that influence. The current queen just definitely wasn't doing things in a way that God would have liked. So, of course, the priest is not fond of that and wants to change that. Now, it's in the 7th year of her reign, so it's been 6 to 7 years where this boy, Joash, was essentially hidden away, pretty much living with the priests. So, him being under their influence, of course, they could shape things more easily toward people following God and getting that, you know, back to the forefront of Judah. So, yeah, he gathers priests and Levites and basically says that, you know, some of them are going to serve as bodyguards for the boy, and with the assumption, I guess, and you can read back in 2 Kings, but they're pretty much planning to put him on the throne, like, literally, physically, pretty much put him on the throne, crown him king, and stop anybody who would try to get in their way. So, that's kind of the idea. Let's continue in verse 8. So the Levites and all the people of Judah did everything as Jehoiada the priest ordered. The commanders took charge of the men reporting for duty that Sabbath, as well as those who were going off duty. Jehoiada the priest did not let anyone go home after their shift ended. Then Jehoiada supplied the commanders with the spears and the large and small shields that had once belonged to King David and were stored in the temple of God. He stationed all the people around the king with their weapons ready. They formed a line from the south side of the temple around to the north side and all around the altar. Then Jehoiada and his sons brought out Joash, the king's son, placed the crown on his head, and presented him with a copy of God's laws. They anointed him and proclaimed him king, and everyone shouted, "Long live the king!" So, at least for a while, it was common practice for the priests to anoint whoever was going to be king. I mean, that even probably goes all the way back to the first king of the combined kingdom of Israel, who was Saul. Samuel had anointed him king and anointed David king after him, and so at least in Judah, it seems like it was still pretty much the priests who declared who was king, in essence. Them being ready to stop anyone who would interfere was probably, I'm guessing Jehoiada thought, well, if Athaliah and anyone under her command, but not loyal to us, catches wind of this, they might try and stop what we're doing. So let's be prepared. So yeah, they pretty much escort Joash as planned to the throne, crown him king, anoint him, and by the way, the reason they keep referring to him as the king's son is because he was the son of the previous king who was ruling before Athaliah. Really, she was probably the grandmother of Joash. But because of her previous, effort to just wipe out the rest of the royal family, Joash would have been included in that, but someone else, possibly the sister of the previous king, which I guess would make her like his aunt or something. Whoever it was, that's kind of up in the air relationally, but she kind of hid him away in the temple, thus leading to all this stuff, and him still being alive even, and the priest being able to then declare him the next king. And it mentions in verse 11 that they presented him with a copy of God's laws, or the covenant, which just further emphasizes their commitment to, raise him as someone who would worship and follow God. And even, hopefully, have him rule that way. Okay. I feel like I've been talking a lot relative to the number of verses we've made it through. So let's continue with verse 12. When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and the shouts of praise to the king, she hurried to the Lord's temple to see what was happening. When she arrived, she saw the newly crowned king standing in his place of authority by the pillar at the temple entrance. The commanders and trumpeters were surrounding him, and people from all over the land were rejoicing and blowing trumpets. Singers with musical instruments were leading the people in a great celebration. When Athaliah saw this, she tore her clothes in despair and shouted, "Treason! Treason!" Then Jehoiada the priest ordered the commanders who were in charge of the troops, "Take her to the soldiers in front of the temple and kill anyone who tries to rescue her." For the priest had said, "She must not be killed in the temple of the Lord." So they seized her and led her out to the entrance of the horse gate on the palace grounds, and they killed her there. Realistically, one could kind of argue that what they were committing was an act of treason, certainly against her as, the ruler of Judah at the time. But, I don't think their intentions were bad. In fact, Jehoiada had probably seen and knew how bad she was, especially how she was, not following the Lord, not worshiping God. So, is committing treason against a bad ruler really a bad thing? I would argue not so much. So, Joash is king now. Athaliah is dead. But they didn't, so she came to the temple area and saw that they had declared Joash king. And her shouting treason was probably also a way of her trying to tell anyone loyal to her that, those who just made Joash king were committing treason and thus should probably be killed by that rule. So killing her might have also been an effort to silence her in that moment. Could have also been sort of a revenge thing. There's multiple different reasons why they might have killed her. Or why they did kill her. Multiple potential reasons why they killed her. But doing it in the temple would have been kind of bad. So they took her outside the temple as to not shed her blood within the temple. That would, for sure, at the very least, make the temple unclean, and then they would have to purify it, and all sorts of things like that. Now this note in verse 14 could be read as, bring her out from between the ranks, or take her out of the temple precincts. Meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain, but I think it's still the same general intent, okay, we need to take her outside the temple before killing her, because killing her in the temple would be a bad thing. It would defile the temple, and of course the priests don't want to do that. Okay, so verse 16. Then Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and the king and the people, that they would be the Lord's people. And all the people went over to the temple of Baal and tore it down. They demolished the altars and smashed the idols, and they killed Mattan, the priest of Baal, in front of the altars. Jehoiada now put the priests and Levites in charge of the temple of the Lord, following all the directions given by David. He also commanded them to present burnt offerings to the Lord, as prescribed by the law of Moses, and to sing and rejoice, as David had instructed. He also stationed gatekeepers at the gates of the Lord's temple, to keep out those who for any reason were ceremonially unclean. Then the commanders, nobles, rulers, and all the people of the land escorted the king from the temple of the Lord. They went through the upper gate and into the palace, and they seated the king on the royal throne. So all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was peaceful because Athaliah had been killed. That implies that it was not peaceful while she was alive. And of course it wasn't. She was, at the very least, attempting to kill off the rest of the royal family. That's not peaceful. Yeah, all this stuff previously had happened at the temple. Now, they're actually moving Joash to the palace and giving him, the throne physically. I guess with the anointing and the dedication ceremony and things like that going on, that would have still normally happened at the temple, though. Also, there's a lot of stuff that's kind of implied in here that isn't outright said. Like the fact that they tore down an altar to, and even a temple to Baal, means that was built before. The fact that he then put the priests and Levites in charge of the temple of the Lord means that they were not in charge, at least for a while. Probably, you know, during the reign of a couple of the kings after Jehoshaphat, the ones who didn't worship God. It might have even outright mentioned that. I forget if that's the case for sure, but it definitely seems to be implied that other people were put in charge of that temple, and definitely would have been put in charge of any other temples or anything like that would have been built to other gods. Yeah, so the sharp downturn that I mentioned at the top of this chapter seems to be on the way back up. Certainly in terms of following God's commands and just worshiping God, and like people being loyal and dedicated to God. So that's kind of how we leave things off at the end of 2 Chronicles 23. Okay, so we have yet another change in leadership of Judah, but this time it seems like it's for the better. No, you know, killing spree or anything like that, although, you know, they did end up killing off Athaliah, just because I pretty much guarantee you she would have fought to try and take the throne back after something like that. She was already calling it treason. But now there's a new king, although he's so young, he's probably not actually gonna be in charge of much of anything for a while, which really means it's sort of Jehoiada and the priests running the show for the time being. But we'll see how that goes moving forward. Although I imagine it'll be, you know, more in line with God than the past couple of rulers were in Judah. But yeah, that comes next chapter. So as always, like and share if you enjoyed the video, subscribe to the channel, click the bell to get updates when I post new videos. Look down in the description for links to social media pages, Discord server, supporter page, anything you might want to follow my activity, interact, keep up with what I'm doing, anything. It's all down there. At least anything that is currently available. And of course, if you want to, you know, leave any thoughts and questions, feel free to do that down in the comments section below the video. So that's it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you soon for another video. But whatever the case is, till next time, stay cool, people.